Today is kind of a different episode because I am actually referencing a video on my iPhoneographer's YouTube channel. Maybe explaining it further is a better way to say that. I recently released a video about how I shot my latest short film pre-owned using the 13 Pro Max, using an iPhone. Mainly talked about how I used two different lenses, two different brands of lenses, but also two different types, meaning an anamorphic and a telephoto, a spherical lens. But I didn't really get into the main reason why I did it, the technical reasons. I talked about how I shot charts, etc., and discovered that certain lenses don't work well anymore on the 13 Pro Max, and that was certainly a large reason I did that. But the main reason, the bigger picture reason, is why I'm using lenses at all on an iPhone. And a lot of people ask me that routinely because the later phones that are out right now, the 13 Pro Max in particular, but the 12 Pro Max, etc., they have built-in lenses and cameras that are pretty good. So why even use external lenses? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Hey guys, Blake Calhoun, and another episode of Almost Professional, the podcast about mobile filmmaking, DIY filmmaking, indie filmmaking, really all things filmmaking. And today looking at indie filmmaking through mobile filmmaking. I guess really it's DIY as well, because I'm using a phone to tell these stories. And specifically today, why I'm using external lenses, in this case a B-script anamorphic and a moment telephoto lens on the 13 Pro Max. And the main reason, the primary reason I do that is because I want to use the main camera only on the phone, the standard wide lens. I don't want to use the telephoto and I don't want to use the ultra wide. Why? Well, because while those lenses are very cool to have on the device, on the phone built in, they are just not nearly as good. And that's what it comes down to. I want to capture the highest quality image, or in this case, video, that I can. I think those built-in lenses and built-in cameras are great for everyday run and gun, family stuff in particular, social media. Super convenient not to have to put a lens on your phone, and also makes it much easier to carry. You don't have to worry about external lenses, or in the case of the B-script anamorphic, you have to actually have a cage to make that work, whether that's the B-script Pro, or in my case, I use the Beast cage. The moment lenses, of course, will fit directly on a moment case, and that's the case that I use all the time. That's my everyday carry case. And so it is really nice and quick to easily just twist a lens on if you need to with a case, or of course, as I was going into, just using the built-in lenses. But when you're making a movie and you want to use varying focal lengths and varying shots, you're not just shooting B-roll of a party. I use the word B-roll because that's the way my brain works. Just footage of a party, maybe your kid's birthday party, as I often say, whatever that may be, a vacation. It's easy to use and it's nice to use the built-in cameras, but they are not nearly as good in any kind of adverse, that's probably the wrong way to say that, not perfect situation, meaning lower light, particularly lower light, or just from a quality perspective. The telephoto in particular degrades, I find, compared to the standard wide, and so I like to put a telephoto on the standard wide. In this case, I was using the Moment 58mm, so it's a 2x tele. You don't get the same reach because on the iPhone 13 Pro, you get a 3x tele. But the 2x tele look with the larger sensor and on the main camera looks really good, and for most things is great. And not only do you get a higher quality image, because the main camera has a faster aperture. Is it a 1.4 or a 1.6? I forget. They change it every year. I'm talking about the 13 Pro Max compared to previous years. But you get the wider aperture, and you get a larger sensor. And so what that means when you're putting a telephoto on there, you are not only getting a longer focal length, but you get the same associated depth of field, and in this case, shallow depth of field. And so that is a big difference maker in and of itself, because that's one thing about shooting with the built-in tele. You don't get the same natural depth of field that you would get with a traditional camera. And that's the way our brains think usually, typically in the 35 millimeter realm. And so a 3x tele, which is equivalent to about, I think, 77 millimeter roughly, you would normally have some pretty shallow depth of field. You don't get that with the phone unless you're shooting something up close. If you're shooting something in the distance, you just get a longer throw, but then the depth of field just looks like you're pushing in on a traditional wider lens. I hope that makes sense. But when you use the external lens, the telephoto in this case, on the wide, you are getting the longer throw, but then you're also getting shallow depth of field. And that made a big difference on my short. And especially if you've seen it, the scenes with the car salesperson, those long lens shots of her face close up, they just look really good and they don't look like they're shot on a phone. The background's way out of focus and it just really pulls you into the story in that situation and into the character's head. And that was my intention. Now, the ultra wide is a cool look, and I do use the ultra wide occasionally. However, again, even though it's much improved with the 13 Pro, it's not nearly as good as the standard wide lens. And so what I do there is I put a wide lens on that, a wider lens. I believe it is natively about equivalent to 26 millimeter. And the ultra wide, by the way, on the camera is equivalent to about 14 millimeter or so. And so what I typically do is I'll use an 18 millimeter wide on the standard wide. Hopefully I'm not confusing you all there. So you get a wide shot using the main camera by using an external lens. Now on the short, I didn't shoot with a standard wide. Typically I would use a Moment 18 millimeter. In this case, I used the B-script 1.33 times anamorphic. I wanted that wider anamorphic cinematic look. And I thought it worked well. And I don't know what the equivalency is on the focal range compared to a traditional camera, but it's probably around that 18 millimeter range. It absolutely widens the shot, but not only does it widen like it would a normal 18 millimeter, you also get the extra widescreen look because of the anamorphic. You know, it stretches the image more or less, the 16:9 regular image into 239. And then you de-squeeze that in post-production, or in this case, I actually de-squeezed it in the app. I used Filmic Pro. And through my testing, I found out that the B-script anamorphic was much sharper edge to edge, totally clean compared to other brands, including Moment. Because you might be wondering, why didn't I just use a Moment anamorphic and keep it simple and put it on the case? That's why. The Moment anamorphic looks pretty good. I've done some extensive testing in some other videos, and it can look really good in certain situations. However, you still do get some weird edge softness that you wouldn't always notice depending on the shot, but it is there. And I didn't find that to be the case using the B-script. And so that's why I used the B-script anamorphic on the Beast cage, and I used the Moment 58 millimeter telephoto on the small rig cage. If you've seen the video, you know what I'm talking about, but I'll do a brief description here on this podcast. So I used two different setups with one phone to achieve the two different looks. A little bit of a pain, admittedly, but all I had to do was change the phone out of the rig each time. Not a huge deal because I didn't switch the camera up a lot, and I had done storyboards and I created a very detailed shot list. And so I knew when and where I would be switching looks or switching lenses. And again, in this case, I didn't really switch lenses. I just switched phone to a different cage. And so that worked out pretty well. And I also used a filter, and the ND filter I had to switch back and forth to, which was a little bit of a pain. However, again, in the video I talk about, I didn't use the Beast cage all the way through because on the Beast cage, you actually have to disassemble it to switch out the lens mount. And the small rig cage doesn't support 37 millimeter mount. And that is what the B-script lens, the anamorphic lens is. It's a 37 millimeter mount, and the Moment lens is a Moment mount. It's called a Moment bayonet mount, which has become a little bit ubiquitous, and I like that. But really, for heavy-duty filmmaking stuff, The 37mm mount screw-on is much more robust, and I actually like it better for those scenarios because you know your stuff's not going to fall off the camera, especially if you're putting filters, etc. on the setup. So again, just to recap, one of the primary reasons I'm even using external lenses is because you get a higher quality image. Not only is it sharper, just a better quality camera in that particular lens on the iPhone, the standard wide, it's also a faster aperture and it's a larger sensor. So you get better image quality, you get better low light performance, and you get more shallow depth of field. And so that's why I still like to use external lenses using an iPhone and cages. And so when I'm doing a movie or something more involved, I absolutely recommend it and I do it myself. If you're just doing, again, run and gun, vlogging or vacation videos or family videos, the built-in stuff is more than fine and works for pretty much everything you would do, except in some situations you may have some trouble again in low light, etc. But in those scenarios, you don't normally care. You're just capturing memories. It's not like when you're doing a professional production, whether that's a YouTube video or a short film or a commercial, whether a B camera, whatever the case may be. I still highly recommend using lenses, even with the latest generation phones. Well, I hope that made sense. I rambled a little bit, and if you didn't see the original video, I'll put a link to that in the show notes here because that'll really make more sense. And this was just a way to further explain why I did that. I had a couple people ask in comments, and I had some people offline ask me. And so I just wanted to go in a little more detail. And I think it's just good to know that external lenses, third-party lenses, are still viable, and I think they will be for some time to come. And in particular, specialty lenses like Anamorphic that you can't get on the phone. But also the fact, as I went over, that you can just get a higher quality using the main camera, but then the main camera is limited because it's a 26mm. So you can add a telephoto or you can add a wide, etc. I'm going to be releasing a video I did about the post-production process on the film too, and I'll go into color grading, how I did the visual effects, etc. But regarding color grading, I did just want to say that if you have the 13 Pro Max and you're shooting ProRes, in particular ProRes log, check out my LUT packs on my website, iPhoneographers.tv. I've got several new packs specifically designed for those color profiles. And I'm going to be adding some more LUTs in the near future that I think will come in really handy even if you're not shooting log. And so look for that. And then of course, if you're new to mobile filmmaking or need a refresher, be sure to check out my website again at iPhoneographers.tv, where I have several courses, one on learning Filmic Pro, another one on general smartphone cinematography. I also have a course on LumaFusion color grading, and I have one on mobile audio production. So if you're interested, definitely check that out, and I will have links in the show notes of this episode. Well, thanks for listening, guys. This is Blake Calhoun, and I look forward to talking to you in the next episode.